Ja, hej och välkomna ska ni vara här idag. Alla ni som är här inne och ni som också är med på länk. Mitt namn är Julia Bergman och jag jobbar på Linköping Science Park som kommunikatör. Och idag har vi bjudit in Joakim Abeleen, Vice President East Asia and Pacific på Business Sweden. Och Johan Thurée, projektledare på Business Sweden i Peking. Och de kommer presentera sina viktigaste punkter och insikter från rapporten Navigating Uncertainty, som handlar om hur man som företag kan navigera i osäkerheterna men också möjligheterna som finns på den kinesiska marknaden. Och vi kommer hålla på i ungefär till 10:30 och innefattande det så avrundar vi med lite diskussion och frågor. Så the stage is yours.
Fantastiskt, tack. Och vi landade i att vi tar det på svenska, engelska eller engelska? English? Preferable? Yeah? No problems at all. The slides are also in English, so you should be able to follow. Questions can of course be in any language, or not in any language, but Swedish, English, preferably, Mandarin maybe. But let's get started and let's get right into it. This is, as Johanna mentioned, it's based on a larger report that we will also be sharing afterwards, where we have been studying and interviewing Swedish companies that are doing business in China and how they are navigating the situations. And then, of course, a lot of things have happened very recently, which we will also touch upon. China has done not some minor changes, some major changes in terms of pandemic policy, etc. So this is the menu we were planning to cover. We'll do a quick introduction to who we are, of course, and then we'll go into China, what we see more on a broader and longer horizon, the shifts in China, what's happening, where were China a couple of years ago and where are they heading, but also a bit more short term, the whole zero COVID policy and what has happened to that and how that impacts companies. And then we will definitely have plenty of time for questions towards the end. If there is anything throughout, just raise your either virtual hands if you're online or real hands if you're sitting here. This is your show. It's not your show, but you can influence what we cover. Business Sweden. We need at least one slide just to try to explain who we are, because it's not always easy. Business Sweden is an organization that is 50% owned by the Swedish government and 50% by Swedish companies through the Association of Companies for Foreign Trade, Sveriges allmänna utrikeshandelsförening. Those are our two owners. And our board is constituted exactly of 50-50, and the whole purpose is, of course, that we should represent Swedish companies and Sweden AB, or Sweden Limited, in equal proportions around the world. We have offices in all these dots, 43, I think, or 42 it's actually right now, because we had to close down one of our offices in Moscow very recently, as you probably understand. But this is what we are working with. Just to quick menu, we're helping companies doing market expansion. That is what we're almost mostly famous for. So going into a new country, for example, or moving into new channels, starting to sell online in China, getting help with that. But of course also then larger mergers, acquisitions. Those have been rather limited in China over the last couple of years, because very few companies have been able to send their due diligence teams into China, but they're still happening. Sales acceleration, so being extended sales arms of Swedish companies, has been extremely important during the pandemic, especially for companies not having people on the ground in the countries. There we can be the sales staff. We're also doing what we call larger mega deals. So any time where there is a deal value for a Swedish or a group of Swedish companies that exceeds 1 billion Swedish kronor, then Business Sweden, together with the whole team Sweden, SEK, EKN, etc., go together and support that deal. We do business to government. Some of us, like myself, are also, besides having a commercial role in Business Sweden, we're also diplomats from Sweden, so helping to open doors in the various countries. Rather relevant in, for example, China. You get a lot of access when you have a formal diplomatic title as well. And then we have business incubation and operations, and I thought that it's always worth highlighting, because we that we often tend to forget, but also sitting in a science park like this. In all our offices almost around the world, we also have the space for Swedish companies to sit, which is of course handy if you only have 2 or 3 employees in a market. It's practical not to have your own office. And then we have a lot of different programs. Many of them are government subsidized. So for example, if you are an SME in Sweden, you can get a lot of support, 50% subsidized by the Swedish government, etc. And the whole purpose is, of course, smaller companies need more financial support to succeed in their internationalization than the large caps. But that's a bit about Business Sweden. And another thing that I've always forgotten over the last 3 years is larger business delegations around the world have not happened during the pandemic, but they're actually starting to happen now. I have a large one to Australia, New Zealand in February, for example. So now we start to see these trips to the world again, where politicians, royal family, the Swedish business society, etc., go together and visit different countries. So that's also one of our main areas. It used to be, and now it's getting back. And just briefly mentioning, I think BINO is a very, it's not the nicest abbreviation, but it stands for Business Incubation and Operations, and it's always just good to be aware of, especially in a market like China. Not only office space, but for example, if you want to hire people in China, either you need to start your own subsidiary to the Swedish company, which you can do. 600 Swedish companies do have subsidiaries in China. But you can also put people on Business Sweden's payroll and get started immediately. So many of these services to facilitate entry, we do not have the strategy to be the WeWorks of Sweden and have people forever, but the whole purpose is to limit the threshold to get started quickly and then hopefully grow and have your own shop in the future. And of course the traditional back office, finance and accounting, payroll services, etc., to make it easy. And to put it into context as well, I said Team Sweden a few times. Business Sweden is not alone. Here in Sweden we have a lot of organizations working together, everything from the Swedish Energy Agency, Almi, etc., in a big group. Out in the markets, and talking about China now, the Team Sweden crew is normally the embassies, of course, the consulate generals, ourselves, the Swedish Chamber of Commerce. People tend to mix Business Sweden with Chambers of Commerce. Chambers of Commerce are member associations of companies in a country, private, while Business Sweden is we don't have any members. We help everyone and owned by government. And then Visit Sweden, the tourist organization as well, is also operating in China. But that was a bit the quick intro to who we are and putting us in a context. We used to be called once upon a time, by the way, we used to be called 2 things, because we are a merger of what was called Exportrådet, Swedish Trade Council, and Invest Sweden. And that's also important to highlight. We both help Swedish companies abroad, but we also help foreign companies, for example, Chinese investors, to invest in Sweden. And as you know, there's been a number of investments, not only recently. We all know what happened 2010 with Geely and the Volvo cars, and that's probably the most famous investment from China towards Sweden. But there's a lot of different investments ticking on, especially around the battery cluster right now. And if any questions on both of these areas, we are more than happy. I think we can answer any. I can answer any questions. So can you, Johan, except for, of course, individual company questions, unless it's your own companies. But sometimes there's a lot of curiosity on how certain companies have been impacted here and there. We will show some company statistics though, but that's open data. Looking at China, it looks very simplistic. Three symbols. scale, speed, and ambition, but I think it's extremely important to just highlight this. When we talk about China, China is huge. Each province in China can be much larger than Sweden. So it's very hard to just do a China strategy. We need to understand that we might go into one province and we might have a different strategy in a different province. Speed, it goes very fast. And I think that's one of the key call-outs we're having now when we meet companies after the pandemic. It's not over yet, but it's different from 2019 when they were in China last time. A lot of things have happened in 3 years' time, and China moves extremely fast. They build new metro lines every week, I was about to say. While being from Stockholm myself, I've seen how long it takes to extend one stop. And then we have the ambition level, and that's also key. China has a very clear ambition, and it's pretty clear in communicating as well, the blueprint. So what do they want to do, not only in the short term, but also coming 5 years, as well as the longer horizon up to 2049. So it's rather easy to decode the intent. And they normally stick to the ambition. So, where is this? It's China. I actually think it is Shenzhen. Yeah. But the whole purpose with the picture is that it's exactly the same place. But it's of course 2 different time periods. But it's not 100 years between them. It's a much shorter time frame, where suddenly very agricultural ground was turned into very industrial ground in a rather short period of time, and suddenly very industrial ground was turned into very commercial ground. A very modern, but I think I think this image illustrates the situation rather well. Super hyper commercial, but still with a state control on top of it, and that's where many places in China are, and that's of course important to realize. If converting this to more concrete aspects, and I will bore you with by not standing in front of it at least. This is what we're seeing overall. We talked about ambition, and it's pretty clear where China is going from, where they're coming from. It used to be very investment-driven economy. China used to boost the GDP by doing a lot of investments. Sometimes they were not so fruitful. They built high-speed railways where there were no people, etc. But the investment button was used quite a lot. Now they want to move towards a much more consumption-driven economy. That is not going very well right now, especially not during the pandemic, but that's still the intent. 2, it used to be pretty cool to be rich in China, and rich people, Jack Ma was highly respected once upon a time. Suddenly but Xi Jinping and the government came in with a common prosperity. We should all be equal, and the rich ones were suddenly hit pretty hard. 1, 2, 3, what does that mean? Children, correct. China used to have a one-child policy. Then they realized that that's not so good, because you get a people pyramid that is like this with only old people. And so they extended to 2 and now to 3. They're landing somewhere on average of 1.15, which is definitely not in line with, much lower than Sweden, which is a bit below 1.7. So China has a huge demographic challenge, as you probably know. Not enough young people to support the society. And I know, Johan, it was recently suggested, it's not been decided, but to shorten the educational period, right?
Yes.
By
2 years.
Yeah.
To get people into universities or the vocational training sooner.
So study shorter and get out. So this is of course an area which is very high up on the agenda, but it's pretty hard to change a mentality, because you build something around the concept of you have one child, you invest everything in that child, and that child will be perfect, and suddenly you're going to have 3, then it's challenging. Moving from coal, as you probably know, China's put up clear targets on being carbon neutral by 2060, peaking in 2030. Again, a challenge right now when with the situation where a lot of new coal plants are also being built because the energy is needed, but it's still standing as a clear and communicated target. Very much catching up, and as you probably know, China was famous for being a bit of copycat before, taking solutions and just copying them, to actually moving into leading innovation in many areas and investing a lot in both more core research but also commercialized innovation. And then a not so invisible hand. It used to be a bit of invisible hand, but it was not so invisible. But now they are communicating very clearly that the state is involved. It's nothing to be ashamed of anymore. And we can all, of course, see also a lot of reports I read in the Swedish Dagens Nyheter today about how the state is controlling researchers in different institutes around the world, etc. This is, of course, something that is being high up on the agenda, not only for China, but the rest of the world is paying attention to this. One Chinese customer used to be rather homogeneous. Now it's getting very diversified customer base, and we'll get back to that as well. How, as a company, how can you actually handle and also a bit diversify your customer base? Analog to digital, I think we all followed how China digitalized itself very rapidly. Deng Xiaoping's mantra, hide your strength and bide your time, has not been so prevalent lately. It's been much more assertiveness. Now that is going down a bit, I must say. We had a few years, you know, you've all heard about wolf warriors around the world, etc. China being very vocal on the global arena. Now that's been down-toned a little bit. But then at the same time, and these might sound contradictory, but they're not really, but China had a much more going global focus before. Now they are focusing more on domestic, being self-sufficient. That's also part of the more global trends now, where we are regionalizing and we are becoming less dependent, or trying to be less dependent on each other. And we can, of course, get back to those. I had a seminar earlier this week where it spoke about US and China as the two main powers of the world. And of course, that interplay is very interesting to follow now. So that was a bit of the overall shift. If you disagree or have questions, etc., just shoot again. This is there's no right or wrong. Or maybe there is in some areas, but in many areas it's a gray zone. I can't continue without just showing the cockpit of this is what I look at every morning when I wake up. I was about to say no, it's not, because most figures are updated once per month, but it's still really relevant to track. You probably know GDP. It's been China's always, or previously always, communicated their GDP targets per year. They've always wanted to keep it around 5-6% at least, and that is to follow a trajectory to become at par, I would say, with Western countries in terms of GDP per capita by 2049. That they have not succeeded with in 2022. The official GDP numbers are not out there. I made a guess in the newspapers today, apparently, where I said it was slightly below 3%, and I think that's in the areas where it will land. It was 3% January to September, but the last quarter has been extremely shaky, and many of the figures have not been released yet. They're being postponed because there's a lot of uncertainty. Fixed asset investments been ticking down quite a lot. Consumption, worst thing, has been really low last year. Of course, both driven by uncertainty, but also by people actually being locked down. As you know, Shanghai, second quarter, everyone was sitting locked in their apartments. You don't shop that much then. There is an intent to boost this, but let's see how it goes. The PMI, Purchasing Managers Index, as you know, or as you might know, if it's above 50, it's an expansion of the economy. If it's below 50, it indicates a contraction. 8 months out of 12 in 2022 were below the 50 line. This is very opposite of what we see in the Western world, where we had inflation extremely high. China has had, and many countries in Asia have been rather low. inflation-wise. On the flip side, they've had a high unemployment, which many countries in the West now are struggling with being too low unemployment, which is pushing salary and inflation even further. And then trade balance. This is not where China aspires to be very high on export. Actually, Sweden and China have previously and historically almost always had an import and export in balance. But now that has also changed a lot. And China wants to not become a US where you're really net importing, but at least getting the trade in balance, starting to consume more domestically and not just ship things to the rest of the world. So, but if you want to play with your GDP and you cannot invest, you cannot consume, well, then net exports is the way to go. So it has at least saved the GDP to some extent. And now comes what happened very recently. This is just to summarize. You probably all heard it in media and through colleagues, etc. But the whole zero COVID policy is gone. In October, during the party conference, they applauded it and said it was great, and there was an indication that it would continue for some time. I also said in many conferences in media that this will continue, it will gradually trickle out, and suddenly it disappeared like this. So surprise to many people. This means that you can easily travel to China today. There are more flights, they're increasing. I just spoke with the Asia head of Scandinavian Airlines who confirmed the same thing. They're opening more flights now to Shanghai, or more departures per week. And we also see the domestic rotation. Before, it's been very hard, even if you get into China, to move around in the country. Much easier. You don't need to take PCR tests all the time. You don't need to quarantine. You don't need to report things all the time and scan QR codes everywhere. So mobility, definitely. But then we have what we just looked at. Economy is struggling. It's not just everything's opening up like this. I think first quarter will be rather painful still from an economic perspective. And why is that? Well, first, a lot of indicators here. China is not famous for just dropping helicopter money to boost consumption. They will do a bit more medium to long term, take actions, i.e. not handing out shopping coupons right away. So seeing how they can, if they manage this, that will be extremely important, because the household savings ratio has increased quite a lot. So there is savings to release into consumption if they do it in the right way. But then, of course, we have this thing. When you abolish the whole zero COVID policy, what happens? People get sick. And there's a lot of people being sick in China. COVID has really spread big time. In the beginning, they were a bit careful with releasing numbers, but there were indications, and we even had the leadership of one of the provinces, Henan, who confirmed that 90% of the population either had or were having COVID-19. And if 90% of your people and your labor force are down sick, we all know what that means in terms of productivity and being able to both consume but also produce. So tough times, and I think that this is what we need to monitor very carefully moving forward. Let's hope that people will get less sick very soon for the benefit not of people, but also, of course, also economy as a whole. And what does it mean for companies now when they have opened up like this? This is actually a summary of what was communicated at the Central Economic Work Conference in mid-December in China, which was held after the zero COVID policy was abandoned. So this is a conference that is held mid-December every year that discusses the economic initiatives for the next year. And what they made very clear is that priority 1, 2, 3 is really boosting the growth in 2023. And how will they do it? Well, again, expand domestic consumption. They must do that. Let's see how it goes now. But also attracting, utilizing foreign capitals. And the property market has had a lot of hits, especially in 2021, that needs to be further stabilized, because it's a pretty significant part of GDP. And then continuing prudent and proactive monetary and fiscal policy. China's not really been using the levers that strong, and they didn't need to have the same rate increases, etc., as the rest of the world, seeing that inflation was not a problem. But that also means that they have a lot of possibilities to play with it moving forward. And then the tech sector, they realize that you cannot just hit all the tech gurus and companies if you want to develop the economy, because tech is critical. So they are reversing this, let's say, a somewhat aggressive stance towards the large tech companies again. And these are the areas where they've said from a business perspective that they are interested in more investments, and they've also been rather vocal that they also want foreign investments. And as you can see, of course, on consumption, both services but also offline retail, that's a clear opportunity for Swedish companies, and we see a lot of the consumer brands moving pretty fast right now. But also healthcare, pharma, as well as the more tech side. These are areas where I would say it's always important with a little bit of caution here. They want short term to boost this, and they are also attracting a lot of foreign investments. On the other hand, they have a very clear made in China. It's not called Made in China 2025 anymore, but the blueprint is still there, where they want to be self-sufficient within a number of areas, including these areas. So there is a more mid-long-term ambition to become very strong domestically. So that's of course before jumping in and jumping on the AI wagon, for example. It's worthwhile combining your own strategies with China's time horizon to see if a short-term opportunity is worth it or not. So that's a little bit on the company side, and I think it's also I like this slide because it shows the last 5 years. Not everything. It's not comprehensive what has happened, but a lot of things have happened in China. We tend to focus a lot on the blue line here, what happened early 2020. And there was there was a virus in Wuhan that then spread throughout the country and the world. That we've talked a lot about over the last 3 years. When will the pandemic be over, etc. But there's also been a lot of other events that are not at all related to the pandemic. They happened both before and after. We tend to forget what happened 2018 when Trump and Xi started their tit-for-tat trade tariff game and hiking tariffs on different commodities. The trade conflict between US and China, it is still there. There's a lot of tariffs still. It has turned into more of a tech conflict though, and most recently we had a US semiconductor ban, the CHIPS Act, where US basically banned the selling of semiconductor technology as well as people or know-how to Chinese interests. So I would say that tech conflict and tech tension will definitely continue moving forward as well. It is a tech race in the world. And a lot of other areas, both we mentioned property market, tech market, etc. There's also been several interruptions suddenly driven, for example, by the climate ambitions, shutting down factories for a couple of weeks to meet certain targets. There's been natural disasters. There's been the tensions around Hong Kong right before the pandemic. And of course, there's a lot of discussions now about tensions with Taiwan. What will that mean moving forward? We don't know what the question mark, but I can guarantee one thing. It will not be completely calm. There will be a lot of events moving forward as well, and we can try to predict them to some extent. So has the pandemic been bad for companies? Yes. I can confirm that. This is a survey we made of Swedish companies in China during 2022. That was before the zero COVID was abolished, but they clearly said that the pandemic had made the Chinese market less attractive. Also, when asked about a bit more longer-term perspective, business performance in the future towards compared to pre-pandemic levels, basically almost 2/3 said that it would be worse than pre-pandemic levels. And the worst thing that was the entry quarantines. So those being gone will of course start opening up a bit, as well as the lockdowns, as well as the flight limitations. So many of these barriers are now disappearing. And I promised I would show something about Swedish companies, so let's do that as well. No business secrets. We don't show things which we shouldn't. This is from the annual reports of Sweden's largest companies, the ones that present China results separately in the annual report. And that is 29 out of the top 100 Swedish companies. And what these show, we don't have the 2022 figures. 2022, we don't have 2022 yet, because most companies have not closed the books. None of them have done it yet. But we can see 2021 compared to 2020, and I think the key call out is, of course, one, many of them are moving, but they're moving in different directions. What we see here is the total global revenue, sales revenue of the company. This is the percentage of how much is in China. And what I think this one tells us three things. It tells us many things, but one, that different companies are hit in different ways, so there's not a general tendency. Depending on your industry and how you played the pandemic, you have either expanded your China footprint or reduced it. But it also says that many Swedish companies have 10, 15, 20% of the global sales in China. So when I get the question, will Swedish companies pull out of China because of pandemic or because of what is happening? The answer is very often no, because you don't want to pull out of 20% of your global sales. You might want to adjust it and do a lot of alterations, but it's such an important market. And then I think this one, I also have to show this one to our Swedish interests and politicians quite often, because we tend to focus on this number. This is the exports from Sweden to China. Those are very easy to see in all reports, all the statistical databases, etc. How much do we export and import? We exported 2021 for 67.5 billion SEK, but the sales figures of the 29 companies who actually declared the sales figures for China, they were more than 5 times higher. So Swedish companies in China sell for much more than the actual export value. So exports are really important, but if it wasn't for China, many of the large Swedish companies would not be as large as they are. And that is, of course, critical. And here you can see the industries as well. Automotive being the top one, but tightly followed by industrial equipment. The life science side being one of the most volatile now, seeing that China wants to be self-sufficient, but they also want to boost it. So that would be interesting to follow. And then consumer goods side. And this is also a question that we asked to the Swedish companies. We do these surveys we do a large one every year, but then we do small pulse surveys regularly to all the Swedish companies that are members of the Swedish Chamber of Commerce in China. They get surveys every day, I was about to say. That's been rather frequent recently because there's a lot of questions popping up. And there we can see, for example, investments moving forward. It's been going down. It's still 47% saying that they will increase the investment, but before it was higher. I think this one is more important. Here the question was based on what we call decoupling, where we ask companies, do you need to adapt to China in terms of your production, your research development, your supply chain, online? IT data was actually the largest one, and that's of course driven a lot by, for example, new cybersecurity regulations. You need to have your local IT setup. You need to store your data in China. You cannot transfer everything cross-border, etc. But this is what's creating a China silo, i.e. you have one setup here and you have one setup in China. And this is also further reinforced by the fact that many Swedish companies say that the pandemic has, and that's actually the Swedish company's China team says that the pandemic has disconnected them from the Swedish headquarters. And that's of course extremely worrisome. You cannot send out new expats, you cannot travel there yourself, and the China team is also saying that they're getting disconnected, and you are physically decoupling a lot of things. So that I think will be a key in 2023, how to reconnect if you have a China presence already. And then just a final bit or a point on investments of larger Swedish companies. Yes, it's actually been increasing. This is more global investments and FDI towards China, gradually increasing. I would still put this into proportion of how much we are investing in US and other areas. China is rather small still. But there are a number of larger investments that have been publicly communicated recently. You might, for example, have followed that Scania now is building one of the largest. They're doing the largest investment into production capacity for many years now on the Chinese east coast in Rugao. So it's clear that things are happening, also happening even during the pandemic in terms of investments into China. But yes. Any questions on the Chinese before we start to talk about how we actually deal with it? Completely silent. And also online, just use the chat and we will be happy to take. We're also collecting a lot of questions towards the end, if anything. But if there's any remarks, etc., just shoot. But I think key here is to say that you saw the timeline. It will be uncertain moving forward. I tend to say, or I start to realize as well that both there's uncertainty in terms of events that can happen, but also a lot of the policies that are being communicated. We shouldn't mistrust them, but we have learned recently that the most important policy to the party top, the zero COVID policy, it was possible to change it like this. Then it also might be that other policies can change. We call it policy volatility, and that's one of the most dangerous things because we've been pretty used to China communicating long-term plans and sticking to them. I talked about the ambition level. If that is not the case, then we need to be even closer and read more signals than ever before, because it can change in a week's time, more or less. But what this one shows is how you or Swedish companies used to view China before. It was a little bit the risk level that we used to take. We used to be pretty bold, somewhere here in the range, active, bold in China. Made some mistakes, we screwed it up every now and then, but it was worth jumping into the wild east and taking risks. We're clearly seeing that is changing now, and the kind of risk. Companies becoming a bit more risk averse when it comes to dealing with the market. If you're 100% risk averse, you cannot do business anywhere, especially not in China. But you need to land a little bit and define what is our risk profile, how much can we take, but also deal a bit more with the risk. And I think two keywords in this is, and Johan will take us through a remarkable framework on how to do it, but it is one, building the resilience. Many companies saw it the tough way in terms of the changes that made. Just when they shut down Shanghai plus, a lot of the areas along the coast, Jiangsu province, etc., because of power cuts. Well, everyone who only had one warehouse where they stored everything in that area, they did not have anything to supply the customers with for quite some times. The ones that had backup alternatives, etc., and also backup logistics routes, they were much stronger. It costs a little bit extra, but unfortunately, what I learned when I studied in the technical high schools of Sweden just in time is unfortunately not working very well anymore. You need to buffer up and you need to have alternative options, etc., in order to respond to shocks and changes. And at the same time also having an agility of switching fast, because that's also something we've seen. Some companies have been extremely fast and rapid at doing adjustments. We'll talk a lot about in China for China versus supplying the rest of the world in China, and what happens if something gets blocked one day. Well, then we need to be able to respond to that rapidly, and we need to have a governance structure that allows us to actually make these decisions pretty fast. Also applying to customer base. If you only supply one customer and it's a large state-owned enterprise that suddenly gets an instruction that they can only buy for domestic suppliers tomorrow, then you have lost your entire customer base. But if you're spreading the eggs a little bit better, then you might of course have a more sustainable model. But yes, Johan, how do we do this in practice? I'm a theoretical person. So
I'm apparently more practical.
Yeah. He's from Linköping. So
oh yes, so therefore I'm also more practical. But yes, so sorry, one second.
Drink some coffee.
Oh yes, that will sure help. Actually, no, I won't. So as Joakim mentioned, many things have happened in China in the past many years in reality, but especially these past few years with a lot of the negative sort of media, like showing the different negative sort of happenings with COVID, power cuts and so on. But there are also some positive things that are also happening. So it is a quite volatile market in that sense, same as many others, but maybe more so now during the pandemic. And these have been a few, as was turbulent and interesting years. And what we see here is that there are three main things that Swedish companies need to think of. Because when it comes to the China strategy and the ambition from the start, many of those were set before the pandemic, revised some as you went along. But the question now is, given everything that has happened and where things are heading, does that strategy and that ambition still make sense? Is it tied to the reality we see today? Or do we need to do a bit of a sort of tweak to that to make sure that we have a reasonable ambition to work towards given the current landscape? At the same time, we also see that Joakim mentioned a lot of the sort of market volatility and the movements. And there we see a need to do a maturity assessment to understand how mature are we as a company to be able to handle these shifts in the market, the more natural ones that happen continuously everywhere, more or less. And lastly, scenario planning. Fancy words, but we have seen occasions recently where we have seen these big shifts. You have the pandemic, for example. You have the power cuts and all those. So Joakim talked about the backup plans, for example. But what do we do as a company if something happens? You can't plan for everything, but what are the things that would impact us the most negative or the most positive from that side? And what are the actions we want to do if those happens to be able to prepare? So these three steps are the sort of main ones that we see a need for Swedish companies to look at. And there are of course things including in each of those to sort of help along the way. So going to the first one here, the ambition. The most common one to think of when you talk about ambition is, when it comes to the left-hand side here, the growth ambition and the potential from a sales perspective. So how much money do you want to make in China? What should be our sales targets, the EBIT, and so on. That, of course, is still relevant, and it is something that should be looked at. But the question is, again, given everything that has happened, what is our target for the future? Maybe the old one that you put before still stands, but maybe we need to tweak that given the new landscape. But on top of that, we also see a need to look at this from production and supply chain perspective, because China is changing. Joakim, you mentioned, for example, the warehouse aspect. Maybe we need to review that setup so we don't have one warehouse where we have all the products. Maybe we need to look at that and see the ambition will be that we need China as a sort of cogwheel in the bigger sort of aspect of APAC or the world. Maybe we need to tweak it a bit given the changes. Look at here, for example, how dependent is our China operations on import to China? It's one thing to look at here. But lastly, when it comes to this, is also from an R&D and innovation perspective. So what is the ambition for technology and product development in China? Because China is a very interesting market, many things are happening. Previously, you could take a lot of the global products into China, but we see, Joakim showed it earlier on the sort of decoupling side, that we see a need, and we also see a sort of, when talking to companies, to innovate and develop for China. Sometimes even in China for the world. That you develop in China, and if that sort of takes off, you can lift it out to other markets as well.
And it's also important to say, I'm building on that, if you see the whole standardization setting, etc., a lot of those discussions are now happening actually in China and trying to influence things that will gradually become global standards, then it's pretty good to be on site.
Exactly. But yeah, so that's the first step, to revisit the ambition that has been set for China and see, does that still make sense? But after that then, and now it's a lot of things on this slide, but from a maturity standpoint, from an organizational perspective, there are 6 main dimensions that we see a need to look at here to cover these different areas, this sort of more normal market volatility. When it comes to go-to-market and portfolio, the questions are, from an offering and content perspective in a way, are we diversified enough? Are we working towards specific industries and having a high exposure to, as Joakim mentioned, state-owned enterprises? How mature are we? Production supply chain, similar, going sort of taking goods into China as well as out of China. How mature is that a setup from our own perspective? Sustainability is another area where we see a need to look at this from sort of a maturity angle. And this is both from an environmental standpoint. Many of the Swedish companies, such as yourselves, have global carbon targets. And if you have operations in China, manufacturing in China, that will have a very big impact on the global one, or have an impact at least. So how mature are we there? But also from the social standpoint, of course. Then we also need to look at the operations from a talent perspective, as well as process perspective. That is different. Governance, Joakim mentioned here the alignment with HQ, which we historically or recently have heard more and more about, that there has been a disconnect between the local organization and the headquarters, which of course is worrisome. So how much are we there? But lastly here, policy and regulations, and this is something that is especially important in China. As Joakim mentioned, there are many of these long-term plans being set in place. It's very policy-driven. And in many ways, when it comes to, for example, the data security laws and the cybersecurity laws, those were talked about for a long time before they were put in place. So if there are mature processes that follow along in this policy development, you might not be sort of taken aback as some companies might have been when these were sort of drafted in plain paper. So by doing this type of exercise, this maturity assessment, which of course is a sort of qualitative and subjective one, so what do we see ourselves? You can get a map that looks something like this. This is just an example. And then based on this, the question is, where would we want to be? Maybe this is the ideal setup. Maybe we feel that for some reason that talent resources, we don't need to be so mature there. We might not have so good processes, but it's fine. We are happy with that. But you might say that when it comes to social sustainability, we really need to improve how we work in this area. So by doing this exercise, you can find these hotspots where you need to work on to improve the maturity to better act on the market. And what is interesting to do in these ones as well is to do one of these exercises with the local team in China and one with headquarters separately, and then comparing the results. So how do our two teams see the operations? Hopefully it's somewhat aligned, but it can also show then, going back to this one, this one, a big disconnect between the teams. And then lastly, as the third step of this 3-step process, is when it comes to scenario planning. Many things can happen, as said. We don't know what's going to happen in the future, but we can start thinking of what are the main areas that can impact us. So in this, there are 4 main themes that we see a need to look at. Market, for example, economy, customers, competitors, and suppliers. Then policy and regulations, both with regards to high-level goals ambition. We can have some industrial ones, economic, and so on. Geopolitics and external relations. Military is one that might be talked more about. Joakim, you mentioned, for example, the Taiwan question. But lastly, also force majeure, which should not be forgotten either. COVID is such one. Big swan events that come from nowhere and impact the business largely. But we also here have the natural disasters. Can be flooding, droughts, and so on that might have some impact. But of course, this, as I've said a few times now, Andreas, can be many different things. There can be a sort of infinite list of events that might happen. So the question here that we need to look at is, within these, what sub-areas do we perceive would have the highest impact on the business? So where do we need to start looking? Maybe we see that the trade here is not so relevant, so let's just ignore that for some reason. But then also, what concrete risks as well as opportunities do we see within these that can impact our business? Do a brainstorming session, workshop to understand what different scenarios can we see here. But then from there, start grouping these based on commonalities and themes to make it a bit more sort of broader and tangible scenarios, because there might be two different outcomes, but the reason might be the same. So those might be connected. And then based on that, anticipate impact and probability. So that going from a long list of scenarios down to, say, 20, 30 themes or group ones, the question is, which are the most impactful ones that we need to think of for the future? You won't necessarily need to be able to make sort of a full contingency plan, because some might be so improbable and so big. But the question is, if that happens, what do we do? To start thinking of options, thinking of action plans that you can set in motion when that happens. Some others that might be more probable, but not as high impact, you might start need to plan for here and now, so that you have a blueprint to act on if they happen. But that is, of course, a discussion that would need to be held to see how do we as a team see these, which are the ones that we need to address and in what way. But to do this type of exercise, to come out with the more relevant scenarios to work for. So that is, in a way, here's another 3-step process. But this is what we see the first sort of step to look at, these 3 as a whole. Those 3 are within the one, in a way. I apologize for that. But then, of course, also look at from governance, model, and process perspective, so that when things happen, you have the right mandate in place. You have the right sort of processes to work on this. But also, not just do that and forget about it, but rather see, how do we track these? If we have 5 scenarios that we see might happen, how can we start getting indications that they will happen? What are the KPIs we can follow to sort of get a feel for the market, where it's developing, and when we need to get ready to mobilize a team, and so on. And this is, we have a few examples of a report behind you, Joakim, that outline these. And
it's very black.
Yes, the front side is also black, but not as much. Where we talk about this and a bit about the Chinese market from this presentation that you're welcome to take with you. We also have a PDF digital format if you prefer that as well.
Modern.
Yes.
Omni-channel, I was about to say.
Analog and digital.
And I think it's key to highlight that, I mean, it sounds like everything is scary and it's volatile and you need to track, and suddenly there will be a big conflict and you need to react. There could also be upsides. There could be positive things happening. And I think, for example, seeing what happened in the commercial vehicles, the truck producers that suddenly saw that the ones that were very close to the market and realized that China suddenly went to approve foreign companies to actually own production licenses in the market in China in 2020. That was abolished the previous ban where you could only hold a minority stake before. And suddenly some of them moved pretty fast, and we just mentioned the ones that have already announced their investments, the commercial vehicle company from Södertälje, who went extremely fast, acquired a local company who had a license and are now already ramping up and building the capabilities as one of the first ones, one of the first foreign ones. So being fast on the positive side as well can definitely pay off. Yes. Is it? Oh, it's a yeah.
Now it's another black
in case you forgot what we look like,
yes.
yeah. then you have some photos there as well. So I think this was a lot of information. It's hard to. We could speak about China forever. On Monday this week, I was asked to give an update on China in 5 minutes. That was also a challenge, but at least then you need to really filter what you're saying. But let's spend the last half hour we have for any questions, either from you or from the chat or from the audience here. And we'll of course be staying around a bit afterwards as well, if anything. So.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Johan and Joakim. So, do we have any questions from the audience?
So thank you, Joakim and Johan. Can you talk a little bit about us? You mentioned US and China.
Yes.
Talking about censorship. Hello. Yeah. So can you talk a little bit about US and China? And you had a seminar you mentioned as well in Stockholm earlier this week. What are the main challenges and what are the trends that you see in this global relationship between these two major countries?
Yes, perfect. Now it's a big question, of course, but yes, it is the two largest economy of the world, and they're definitely in a race to some extent, especially on the tech side. And I would say that, of course, what's happening now is there's a lot of discussions on the semiconductor side, because semiconductors are extremely important in a number of industries. There's a number of countries, of course, involved in semiconductors, but if you see the largest ones, US is large, and then you have a lot of the large ones on the Asian side, Japan, South Korea, and then you have mainland China and Taiwan, where there's, of course, some of them are better at the smallest semiconductors as well than others, i.e. the more high tech, so it's not just one basket. But that will, of course, continue being a big both race but also tension between markets. Everyone wants to be in control of the semiconductors because you're so vulnerable if you're not controlling it. But that's not the only part. There is the previous trade conflict that started 3, 4, 5 years ago almost is still there, and there's tariffs, and there's a lot of the mechanisms that were put in place. But in terms of your question there, is it a particular field you're thinking of how that will pan out, or more general? Yeah. Well, of course, those of you following US politics, you will realize that things are changing a bit between different presidents. There are certain shifts there on a regular basis. And of course, that we'll see what happens in the next round. But I think US has also shown that no matter whether Republican or Democratic leadership, there will still be a tension, a regional let's say self-sufficiency. EU is also stepping into the game now, as you probably know, and discussing how to handle, amongst others, China, and trying to have a bit more unified strategy there. So I think we should see both EU, US, and China, and how that pans out. We also know that new requirements are popping up in the EU now in terms of supply chain due diligence, EU-based companies getting strong requirements on how they monitor their supply chains around the world. And we also see that China, on the other hand, they are playing, of course, the game that we don't want to be all alone. We want to create agreements with other countries. If they cannot create agreements with the US because there's a lot of tariffs, there are other free trade agreements that are now being discussed. China is now active in at least 2 larger dialogues on free trade agreements. Normally they used to be much more bilaterally discussing, but now China is opening up for multilateral agreements, of course, to get more friends into their circle. And then we have other initiatives from China's side that have been there for a couple of years, that have been downtoned a bit lately. But for example, the Belt and Road Initiative that you might have heard about before, where China has done a lot of investments into selected countries around the world to, of course, get closer links to those countries. That has maybe not been the main focus over the last couple of years because of the pandemic, but I think we will also see more of these attempts to connect other nations and economies. Because China cannot do it alone, that they are aware of. They want to be self-sufficient, but they also need to collaborate. it used to be called something that confused a lot of people, dual circulation. China wanted to have a domestic circulation and an international circulation. They should be interconnected. It was pretty hard to explain it, but there is a fundamental reasoning behind that, and they have a clear strategy to collaborate with certain markets while at the same time building up the self-sufficiency. But let's see where that attention will continue. That's for sure. That it will be more tech-oriented. That I can almost check as well. But exactly what it means and how aggressive it will be remains to be seen.
Thank you. Do we have another question?
If not just building on just also adding to it, because we tend to say US, China, does it mean anything for Swedish companies? Yes, it definitely does, because Swedish companies are very often squeezed in the middle as well. Something that is not only related to semiconductors, something that's been very obvious for a number of Swedish companies is some of the requirements. US has export controls that stipulate that you cannot sell to certain Chinese companies, for example. And if you as a Swedish company have certain components into your solutions, both software and hardware, then you cannot sell it to a long list of Chinese companies. And then it's, of course, that's questions that we have been helping to address a number of times, also raising it to the US authorities. Does this content actually constitute that the Swedish company also falls under these export controls or not? Because most of US regulations in this field is extraterritorial, i.e. they can also apply it to a Swedish AB if they want to. Yes.
So there's been a lot of I don't know, rumors or trends going in for international companies moving production away from China, mainly to maybe India. Is the Chinese state doing anything to try and prevent this, and what's their strategy moving forward with that?
Great question, and I think you primarily, of course, it's been the big fruit company who started spurring these trends. But yes, absolutely. I think we're overall seeing a lot of diversification. It's not been so much moving entire production or moving entire supply chains, because that's close to impossible, but more again spreading the eggs a little bit, and also when opening up new, not doing it in the same place but actually expanding it elsewhere. That companies are diversifying. It happens both out of China but also in many places within China instead of being in one location. Of course, I think that will continue as a strategy. I think we are also encouraging diversification because that's healthy. What the state will do about it moving forward, well, I hope that they will work on attracting companies, because it's hard to ban people from producing elsewhere. So let's see now when we're going post-pandemic and the economy is starting to ramp up and there are possibilities again. I think we will see a lot of encouragement to have both production, but of course also other functions. For example, R&D, etc. In China, you will probably see these incentive schemes coming in again and saying if you move this and this, you can get these kind of tax benefits, etc. You have probably encountered them before as well. It happens pretty regularly, both on larger levels, but also individual sites and parks around in China that have as a KPI to attract more foreign investments, and the best way to do that is to come with encouragement. So it could of course be a little bit of stick, but I think it's going to be a lot of carrots. That doesn't mean that we should swallow all the carrots and move everything to one place because they have a great tax scheme for the first 3 years. We always need, no matter where in the world we're moving, we need to take it very cautiously and see what does it mean. What does it mean for my IP that I might be moving in? Am I stuck there for a long period of time? If I start up a company in China, how long does it take to liquidate it if I need 5 years later, etc., to make that careful planning? But yes, I think there's going to be a lot of attempts and encouragement to get more companies in. And that's also clearly specified in the 2023 plan. Boosting economy and attracting more foreign investments, capital companies in.
Yep.
So you say that China wants to be self-sufficient, and also that we also have this U.S. Banning some export to China, etc. Do you see any risk that there would be regulations in China that they are not allowed to buy certain components and products from other countries, like if they have Chinese brands for whatever? They have some regulations from the government to only buy Chinese products, for example. Do you see any risks for that?
Absolutely. There is in certain fields, and that's also good to keep track on. For example, China has specified in certain areas, and they've made it clear which towers that is. They want to be self-sufficient, and they've put, before they were even putting clear percentages of how much of that within that field would then be domestically produced of what is consumed in the country. In order to deliver these KPIs, then that needs to trickle down, and then people, when they purchase things, they get also KPIs a little bit on how much. So for example, in the pharma, biotech side, etc., that's already been common that it can be harder to sell if you're a foreign company. For example, a public procurement process could then score the sellers based on whether it's a domestic product or a foreign product. And if you get more points being a domestic product, well, then you suddenly rank higher. But then the question is, how do you become domestic? And that's been a bit of a gray line. Is a foreign company who's producing it in China, is that then domestic or is it foreign? And that's been interpreted a bit differently in case to case. So it's also important to always push the purchasers, authorities, etc., and say, if I want to be part of this, what are the real requirements? And I think that's a shifting needle again. You cannot move from 0 to 1. You can if you're a computer, but in real life, you need to gradually shift towards self-sufficiency. And right now, they are in the middle. They are still dependent on foreign companies and foreign products. And many Swedish companies, especially on the industrial side, they have a lot of benefits still because of the quality, also climate technology we are extremely strong at. So they can still sell because they're better than many of the local options. But the day when China is becoming stronger and stronger and more capable products, which they are getting, well, then it's going to be easier for the domestic providers. Absolutely.
Do we have any questions from chat? No? Anyone else? Well, then I have a question.
Oh.
And that's how can Swedish companies look at their own investments in their business regarding recent events?
Yeah. Do you want?
Should I take it?
I think I'm talking too much.
No, yeah. Yes.
Thanks.
No, but it is, as we talked about, there are things happening in China that add some risk, but as Joakim mentioned, there are also many opportunities that can happen. It's still a very big market. There is still a lot of potential to gain. So it is all about sort of looking at it from maybe a bit different lens than before, become a bit more risk sort of cautious in a way, to do due diligence, to think of sort of, okay, but how do we do this in the best way? Because if you don't do investments in the market, if you just sort of pause it, as Joakim mentioned, the domestic competition is increasing. The competition doesn't stand still. So if you don't do anything, you will most likely slowly or quickly get squeezed out. So it is about looking at it still sort of from a ambition level, where do we want to go and what do we need to do to do so, to get there. But to do this with a lens of what's happening and to having a bit more sort of an analysis behind it maybe than before. I'm not sure, Joakim, if you have any other additions to that.
No, I think you're right, and I think key will be to be close to the market. If you have a team on the ground, you're lucky because then you have someone being close to the market. If you don't, you really need to work actively because there's going to be so much things happening now. And then it's up to each company to decide whether that's a good investment situation or not.
In which areas do you see potential for Swedish companies in China?
I mean, some of the areas that China has been stipulating, I showed on the previous slide, but that's of course where they want investment. But I think it's a good question to say, where should we go in or where do we see opportunities? Sweden is still very respected in a number of areas, and you saw where Swedish companies are playing in the automotive side. Definitely, we have a lot of respect in the pharma side. We have a lot of respect, but also the large industrial corporations are highly respected. But then I think climate technology will be a key area. China must continue delivering on their pledge to become carbon neutral. Sweden is the first, or will be the first OECD country, hopefully, to reach climate neutrality. And that is well known in the Chinese market, that we know how we play it. Can also add that Business Sweden is running promotional platforms for Swedish companies, so not just helping one company at a time, but we're finding themes where we believe that there's high value for Swedish companies to be in a certain market. Towards China, we spend, and that's of course government funded, so we need to carefully allocate those money. For China, the vast part of those promotional initiatives are related to the green transition. We run a large program called Pioneer the Possible, together with the Swedish Institute and several actors, where we also have defined 4 areas within the green transition for Swedish companies in China. And it is about, and correct me if I'm losing, but it's about driving green production. So how can you actually completely greenify your production side? It is about the green mobility, where we have a lot of good solutions in Sweden. It's about sustainable urban living, so building up systems that are more eco-friendly. We've even built a replica of Hammarby Sjöstad along the coast in Shandong province in China. And then the fourth one is the whole supply chain circularity aspects, where we of course have a lot of good solutions for circularity. And this platform is both to help Swedish companies actually becoming green in China, but also to promote Swedish solutions into the market, which is going very rapidly. I mean, that's the thing in China. A few years back, you could not buy green energy in China at all. If I create a factory in China tomorrow, I would just get some power, and it would probably be coal-fueled. Today, you can put requirements that I want 100% renewable into my factory. So only certain places, but we have actually negotiated last year in 2022 a deal where we're getting committed green 100% renewable energy for selected Swedish companies. So driving these changes, there is a high appetite to learn from us. So if you have climate-friendly solutions, that's an area to play in.
So when's the right time to invest in China, would you say?
Yesterday?
Yes. No, but I mean, it's similar to the stock market in a way. You're never gonna hit the optimal time. So it's all about, again, going back to what we want to do. If you want to enter China, if you want to build capacity, then not wait for an optimal time, because things will continue to happen, positive and negative, I would say.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And it's very sector specific and where you are, but I've got a lot of questions over the last couple of weeks. Should we now fly over to China since it's easy to get a visa and no quarantine? Or should we wait for 3 or 6 or 9 months? So when is the right time to do that next acquisition or hire 3 people in Shanghai to start working, etc.? And I think that decision will be very individual, but just like Johan said, our main competitors in China are not necessarily other Swedish companies or European companies. It is the Chinese companies, and they are moving ahead. They are not sitting and waiting, and a lot of things are happening very fast on that side. So if we wanna keep the pace, it's good to be there pretty soon. Yes.
Do we have any more questions? Nothing from online? Okay. Then thank you very much, Johan and Joakim. And if you want to read more, they will hand out the report. And you can find more information on Business Sweden's website.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You can find a lot of things there.
Yeah. And keep an eye on Linköping Science Park's website as well, because we're going to host many interesting events in the near future. So thank you very much. A big applause, and thank you very much for everyone listening.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you very much for inviting us here.
Oh, yes.
A pleasure.
So yeah, take the time and talk to each other and mingle around.
Gra
Thank you.
grab a last sandwich. Yeah.
Yes, and we'll
If
stay
there's-
here for some time more, so if you want to talk one-on-one, you're of course welcome.
I promise to
Come
turn
out.
off the mic if any secrets. Yeah.